What if a sky could reflect an emotion? This concept kicked off my Blender short, Whiskers and Whirls. It centered around the inner world of a meditating cat, where each sky was designed to represent a feeling. From fog of uncertainty to embers of passion, and from cosmic serenity to divine stillness. In the first part of my breakdown, I'll walk you through how I created each animated sky using Blender's World Shader. Each sky was designed to reflect different emotional states, using mostly procedural nodes. No images, no plugins, just light, texture, and mood. If this inspires you or helps you learn something new, I'd really appreciate if you could like the video, share it with a fellow artist, and subscribe for more stylized films and breakdowns. Thanks for being here. Let's jump right into it. Alright, let's start with the first sky, the fog of uncertainty. Here's a reference sheet I use for inspiration. I wanted the sky to feel like the kind of mental clutter that often settles in before meditation begins. A hazy space of overthinking where thoughts drift in and out. The overall color palette is based on these soft bluish-green tones. I wanted the fog itself to have movement, like it was slowly swirling across the sky. And finally, this image really stood out to me. These vertical light pillars reminded me of intrusive thoughts, sudden, bright, and fleeting. So I wanted to incorporate a similar effect to represent the thoughts that rise up unexpectedly. To save time from modeling and animating a new character from scratch, I reused a samurai cat from my earlier project and placed it as the anchor for the scene. Now, let's jump straight into building the world shader. For all the skies in this project, I started with a simple base setup. Two background shaders are connected to a mix shader, and the east camera ray output from a light path node is plugged into the factor input. This allows me to control the visible background color separately from the actual lighting contribution of the world. Super helpful for stylized scenes like this one. Next, I created a gradient across the sky using a gradient texture and a color ramp plugged into a background shader. To orient the shader, I connected a mapping node to the texture coordinates. And this can be used to tweak the flow of the colors from the horizon to the sky. Now, here's where things got a bit messy. I went down into a bit of rabbit hole trying to use noise textures to build fog layers, but the first few attempts didn't really give me the depth or feel I was looking for. I'll show you a quick overview of the trial and error process here, but if you'd like to skip straight to the working version, jump to the 4-minute mark. Eventually, I scraped all that and started fresh. I went back to the gradient texture plus color ramp combo to rebuild the sky, this time focusing on the palette from my reference board, shifting from dark navy blues to soft green tones to give that murky, uncertain vibe. Next, let's build the swirling fog effect that defines the sky. To do that, I added a noise texture and connected it to a mapping node, which is then layered on top of the gradient sky we created earlier. Here's a trick. I scale the y-axis to 10 in the mapping node. This stretches the noise vertically and gives that radial swirl appearance. I also added a color ramp after the noise and pulled in bluish green straight from our reference sheet. After a few iterations, I switched the mix node to soft light. It gave me a subtle, dreamy blend that felt just right for this emotional state. Feel free to pause here if you would like to check the exact values I use for the noise setup. Finally, to simulate those sudden pulses of light, the thoughts breaking through the fog, I reused the same gradient texture plus color ramp combo. This time, I fed it into a mix node set to a color dodge mode, blending it into the background. By animating the values in the color ramp, I can make those pulses appear and disappear in rhythm. And there we go, the base sky for the fog of uncertainty is done. And here is a final note tree for your reference. Let's move on to the next one. The next sky is Ember of Passion, representing the inner turmoil and the intense thoughts that the cat experiences during meditation. Here's a reference sheet I put together. I was inspired by the hazy crimson skies, flickering sparks along the horizon, and an overall sense of pressure or heat, just like the world itself is glowing from within. Just like before, I started with a base setup, using a gradient texture connected to a color ramp to define the overall tone of the sky. Next, I added a hazy aura. This was done using a 2D texture passed through a color ramp, and then layered into the base gradient using a mix shader. To control the look, I pull colors directly from the reference: deep reds, burnt oranges, and a touch of purple. After some experimentation, I switched the mix node to overlay, which gave me that intense, atmospheric glow that I was looking for. To simulate embers floating across the sky, I use a Voronoi texture connected to a color ramp. This was then blended to the earlier sky using an add node. I increased the scale of the Voronoi significantly and then adjusted the black and white points of the color ramp to isolate small, scattered specks of light. Once I had that pattern dialed in, I mixed it with the previous sky using another add shader, placing the sparks gently over the horizon. To add more depth and motion, I also incorporated a swirling noise layer similar to the fog effect from the first sky. It helped break up the gradient and added that chaotic energy that I wanted to express. Here's a full world shader setup if you'd like to pause and study it. Feel free to tweak it for your own stylized projects. Alright, let's move on to the Sky 3, Cosmic Serenity. For the third sky, Cosmic Serenity, I wanted to reflect a shift in the meditative journey. This one represents detachment, calm awareness, and euphoric stillness. A samurai cat has now entered a world within, surrounded by stars, galaxies, and cosmic light. The goal was to build a mystical atmosphere using cool blue and purple hues with flowing auroras. A lot of tips and tricks for this one came from Christoph's Anime Sky tutorial. Check it out. I've linked it in the description. As with the previous skies, I began it with the base layer, a gradient texture fed into a color ramp to create the sky's background transition. To form the galaxy-like layer across the sky, I stacked a vertical gradient column on top of the base sky and blended it using a color dodge mix shader for that radiant glow effect. To add some irregularity, I introduced a combination of two noise textures blended together and applied along the x-axis using a separate XYZ setup in the mapping node. This allowed me to distort the shape horizontally without affecting the vertical flow. You'll see a quick montage here where I tweak the noise scale, strength, and mapping position to find the look and placement I wanted for the glowing band of cosmic energy. Next, I created the aurora effect. This was also made using the gradient texture and color ramp, carefully adjusting the black values to sculpt the bands of light. Again, I used color dodge in the mix node to make it feel like it's glowing above the galaxy layer. For the stars, I reused the same method from the Ember of Passion sky, a Voronoi texture plugged into a color ramp and then mixed into the scene. By tweaking the scale and color ramp values, I got a soft scatter of stars across the skyline. To finish things off, I added a second aurora layer with a slightly different color and position, just to add depth and variety to the sky. As you can probably tell, this one took a fair bit of fine-tuning. I spent quite a bit of time adjusting the balance between elements as shown here. Here's a final world shader node tree for Cosmic Serenity. Feel free to pause and use it as a reference for your own projects. Alright, on to the final sky, Divine Stillness. The final sky in the series is called Divine Stillness, representing a moment of peace, balance, and clarity at the end of the meditative journey. Here is a reference board I used. The vision for the scene was clean, open sky filled with soft, bluish-green hues and gentle, stylized clouds. Something simple, serene, and expansive. As usual, I started with a base gradient sky, using a gradient texture and a color ramp to define the soft transition of colors across the background. To build the cloud layer, I used a noise texture connected to a color ramp and layered it into the base sky using a darkened node. This keeps the clouds subtle and allows them to blend naturally into the gradient. I adjusted the mapping node to stretch the noise along the horizontal axis, creating that stylized, elongated cloud form. From there, I fine-tuned the color ramp to introduce lighter, misty tones that matched my reference clouds. Finally, to add some gentle movement, I animated the rotation values in the mapping node, causing the colors to drift slowly across the sky. This sky is intentionally minimal, designed to feel like a deep breath after everything that came before. That completes our 4 stylized skies, each reflecting a different emotional state. Here's a quick look at the final world shader setup for Divine Stillness.